I am very delighted indeed to be talking with Malcolm Guite. Hi there, Malcolm.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you again.
Yeah, look, we're going to talk about William Blake primarily, someone that you've written about as well as I've written about, but the near contemporary of Blake, Coleridge, is also someone you've written extensively about, and what the imagination means, what's happened to the imagination, and then I guess particularly in relation to Christianity.
Yeah.
And our relationships with the rest of the natural world and also with the divine.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned our relationships with the natural world, because I quite often what I write, and I don't know if it's true with you, and it gets pigeonholed as it's about Christianity. But if you take the radical ideas about the nature of perception by both Blake and Coleridge seriously, they're not just talking about their faiths respectively. They're talking about epistemology, about the whole way we see the world. They're saying things that are relevant to science and to writings about nature. You know, both Blake and Coleridge are people who will not stay in the little boxes that modern academic discourse would like them to keep them in.
Well, that's what your book about Coleridge was very much about, and mine on Blake too, trying to say that, you know, this is not a chap you can call crazy and keep safe, not a chap that you can think was a sort of lost visionary and keep safe. No, someone who was deeply engaged with all the currents of his day, which had become ours, and was also a visionary in a way that invites us into a more expansive world, not allows us just to sort of put him in the box, smart, hyper fantastic,
yes, absolutely.
something.
I must say, a feature of your book, I think I said this in the review I wrote of it in the Church Times, but a feature of your book that I particularly enjoyed was that, unlike many writers on Blake, you didn't medicalise him. You didn't, which I thought, you know, perhaps given your experience in psychotherapy, you know, you might have been tempted to do. You didn't, as it were, do that rather high-handed kind of condescending thing that a lot of modern writers do about writers from the past, which is to assume that we know better now and to explain away any peculiarity of theirs that doesn't happen to fit with our worldview. I thought your central premise in that book, which was essentially, let's take Blake seriously and listen to what he has to say as if it mattered, that was most refreshing.
Yeah, well, it's because I'm a psychotherapist in a way, because I mean, there is a bit of a thing in psychotherapy about not diagnosing people, but also I have a profound sense that psychology in general needs the more that figures like Blake can offer, actually. And inviting people to try and manage their own lives solely on the grounds that we're trapped inside our own heads is actually part of the disservice. But anyway, maybe we'll get back onto that. I mean, another quick reflection on the natural world thing. I mean, my sense is that the natural world matters not just because it's part of God's creation too, but because it's a kind of triangulation between ourselves, the rest of the living world, that actually precipitates the perception of the divine in Blake.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way it works. And so you've got to try and engage with that sense of nature being imagination itself, as Blake puts it.
Yeah, well, exactly. Now, so one of the most Blake occasionally says things which are so startling that they shock you awake, to use your word, almost like a sort of Zen koan. And I remember the first time I read, I'm not sure which work, I think it may be in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Anyway, Blake says, the five senses are the chief inlets of soul in the present generation. You're going, what? You know, I've been trained all my life to believe that soul is some weird, wispy, entirely subjective thing, and out there is dead matter, and my senses are merely information processing, sensors that allow me to register data. So the idea that real soul is out there, and that it's coming into me through my senses, that was such a radical reversal. It was itself, as it was kind of a wake-up call, if ever there was. Oh my goodness, what a radically different way of seeing everything. That everything I see, the mountaintops, the lakes, your face, anything is an expression of soul as well as a quote-unquote physical phenomenon.
Yeah, and you're now already nudging me towards another shared interest, Owen Barfield. But look, let's maybe just like put something down to begin here. What are we talking against in a way? What notion of the imagination tends to obtain in the modern world. Blake saw it coming. I think it's even in spiritual circles often too. And you talk about this actually in your book about Coleridge as well as other places. But I'm thinking of this sense that somehow the imagination's been confined to the subjective.
Yes,
And the
exactly.
subjective is dislocated, not, as it were, an
Yes,
inlet.
so this is the thing we have to resist. The thing is a thing that's become so normative for the kind of Western culture that we happen to live in, that it's become what the French call an idée reçue. It's such a deep idea, we don't even know it's an idea. We don't even know that there's an alternative way of seeing things. So right at the heart of that is this fundamental division that's been made, which is actually, it's a distinction. It's not a division. You know, Coleridge said it's philosophers' privilege to distinguish but not to divide, but we divide. So this is the division as we inherited between so-called subjective and so-called objective, particularly subjective knowledge and objective knowledge. And for very understandable reasons, during the course of the scientific revolution and then following on from the Enlightenment, we're talking sort of from the mid-17th century on right through into the 19th century, partly because, you know, I have to say religion had blotted its copybook very considerably, and religious enthusiasms leading to civil wars and 100 Years' Wars and so on, you know. There was a natural reaction, and people said, look, can we just have less of your high-flying and highfalutin theology, and let's have the facts of the case. But the presumption was that the facts of the case were entirely objective in sense that they were about objects out there. The subject was merely how you privately feel about things. And what the scientific revolution did was it privileged objective knowledge as somehow more real and more true and pertaining to it, to the point that it ultimately just, I describe it in my book, Faith and Hope and Poetry, as a kind of, I mean, we take it that the word episteme means knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. I called it an epistemological apartheid, where essentially we have the mainstream economy, which is observable quantity, measurable quantity, scientific fact, testable, and reducible to a series of essential laws, especially those of Newtonian motion, action and reaction. And that was the real thing. And then anything else was a private subjective whim. And onto that divide, the Enlightenment proceeded to map everything. There was no middle ground. There was no interplay between the two. So everything which we had to decide which side it was on, or have it decided for them by the culture makers of the day. So the first thing they did was to say, well, imagination, rhetoric, fancy, all of those things are clearly on the subjective side, they thought. Whereas logic and reason, particularly a kind of analytic reason, were clearly a tool to get at objective knowledge. So onto the, in my view, false split or dichotomy between object and subject. By the way, I mean, the reason why that's a false split is blindingly obvious as soon as you stop to think about it, because the one thing that we all share in the very endeavor to know anything is consciousness. And when you say I'm conscious, you are simultaneously using subject and object. I, subject, am conscious, verb. Well, what am I conscious of? I'm conscious of me, object. So a conscious self is always simultaneously fully subject and fully object, because it's the object of its own subjectivity. Anyway, setting that aside, here's this split. Now, remember, the objective side of this division is the privileged one. So reason, and analytic reason in particular, logic, that side of the mind, you know, we can start glancing in the direction of Ian McGilchrist at this point. That side of the mind is privileged. The imagination and everything that it can do is somehow shoved over onto this. They're like little Bantu stands, separate development, as the South Africans called it. You can have as much, you know, as you can have as much art and dancing as you like, as long as it really doesn't make any difference to anything or how we know. That's mere subjectivity. And I remember coming across this subject-object split in the most dramatic and actually almost penal form when I joined the English school system fairly late in the day, having been brought up in Africa and various other places. And I sort of turned up at the age of 13 or 14 in a sort of third form chemistry lesson. And we had these wonderful experiments to do with acids and alkali. And we had the litmus paper and it changed colour. It was wonderful. So we were all to write up our results of what we'd done in the lab in our homework. And I wrote, in my humble opinion, for a 14-year-old, a not inconsiderable prose poem about how astonished I was by all of this. Now, I had all the facts in it. I had how many, centiliters had been titrated and all of that I had down there. But I was also saying it changed colour. It was extraordinary. It had to be there. And, so I saw that the master, when he was going with his homework, singled mine out. And I sat down with some sort of, placid assumption I was in for some praise. And he held the book up. And it was covered in red ink. And every single time I'd used the first person singular, he had crossed it out in red ink. And he said, Guite, we never bring ourselves into our experiments. And I said, well, what was I supposed to say? I did titrate the mixture. No, he says, you must use the passive voice, thus torturing the English language. The mixture was titrated. It was observed that a measurement was found to be, but never I did it. I measured it. I saw it. I said, oh, sir, so I'm supposed to write it as if nobody was actually there. And he said, yes, that's what makes it objective. And I clutched my head in my hands. I thought there's something wrong here.
And I think that sort of the paradox of all that, or the irony of all that is that, as Blake saw, I think, the scientific approach is one that is itself dependent upon a very particular and intense kind of imagination. So which is why he depicts Newton, who's often his kind of figure of his target for ire, nonetheless as a kind of very imaginative figure, but focused down through the compasses on the abstraction on the piece of paper. And then, strangely, I mean, in a way your story echoes this, imagining that the world is somehow captured by these laws and logic, and generalizations and so on. And I think that, such is the power of Newton's imagination that he sees these extraordinary symmetries between a falling apple and the moon revolving around the earth or whatever, makes them tractable in mathematics. And I think that a part of what happens that fosters this split, people are so amazed really by the success of these simple formulas that they go off looking for laws in all sorts of other directions as well. So you have in the next generation people like John Locke looking for the laws of governance and the laws of the mind. And his books on the mind, I think, particularly contract the imagination, make it this kind of little private faculty we have that can juggle the sense states of the fall on the tabula rasa and so on. So it spreads. It spreads in all directions, I think.
I think we are all the inheritors of that. So one of the distinctions we need to make, I expect many of the listeners and viewers to this podcast will have already made this, but it is just worth emphasizing, is that because imagination was dumped into the little Bantustan of the subjective in this revolution, this scientific revolution, the very meaning of imagination itself was changed. So if you say, how do you use your imagination, to most people now, they'll simply say, to make things up. That the imagination is seen as this little private creative faculty which makes up stuff that isn't true. Hence the word imaginary is always used to mean not real. And we have to recover many and widespread, much earlier understandings of imagination. The word imagination has got the word image in it. And some people would argue that the imagination, which is the sort of synthesizing power that understands the meaning of things, it understands pattern and shape, the raw data that's flowing into us now, there's no reason why, objectively, I should privilege the spines of the books behind you, Mark, over the particularity of your human face divine, countenance divine, as Blake would say. But there's something in me that that seizes and selects and actively looks upon the bits of data that make a human face and which shapes it in some way. And I've done that since I was a baby. I've always wanted, as it were, within the raw data to shape and find. And that is not making stuff up. That's about seeing things. And as we know, I mean, eventually Coleridge felt it necessary to redefine imagination and talk about what he called the primary imagination. And he said, he called it the living power and prime agent, that's active. He called it the living power and prime agent of all human perception. All human perception. This is before you start writing glorious Blakey and visionary poems. This is just looking at a sunset or a forest. That the more, and actually that view, that as well as the rational analytic, there is, if you like, the magical synthesizing imagistic. That view becomes stronger and stronger the more we find out what matter actually is. Locke and Hume and things really thought it was a solid thing. The more we understand that matter is mostly empty space and that every part of it is in motion and that it's a form of energy anyway, the more extraordinary it is that we perceive the phenomena, the appearances that we do perceive. So imagination has as much to do with perceiving the so-called objective world as it has to do with the other beautiful thing, which Coleridge calls the secondary imagination, of being able to make up new worlds ourselves and be sub-creators, as Tolkien says.
No, I think this is really important, actually, because when you talk, another sort of ramification of this privatizing of the imagination has made it seem very scarce, and like only the extraordinary artist or the extraordinary poet kind of has imagination. Whereas I think it's really important to, in a way, demystify the imagination. And as you're saying there, if you're hearing words, not just sound waves somehow pulsing out of the speaker, but if you're hearing words that have some kind of meaning and you're following the conversation, that is the imagination at work. The imagination already has you in terms of your understanding. You know,
Exactly.
And if you, anything that you see, as you're saying, that carries some significance, that's not just, and significance needn't be great, weighty kind of existential significance, just that you're seeing it as it is. That is the imagination. You know, we all have the imagination, and if you met someone without imagination, it would actually be deeply disturbing, I think. It would be some kind of deep sociopathic experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very important. I'm glad you mentioned the idea that we've created a sort of false scarcity of imagination. I think the imagination is abundant in all of us. On that thing about discerning words, that's a very good example. And it calls to mind a very helpful distinction that C.S. Lewis makes in one of his later essays, where he says, I mean, he was a man who was very keen on reason and wrote very good rational apologetics as well as imaginative apologetics. But in a later essay, he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. It's imagination that enables me to discern the meaning in the truths that come to me. And I think that's absolutely essential. Going back to words, it's not just a question of perceiving words. I very much resist the idea that, you know, there's the odd isolated poetic genius, the Shakespeares of this world, who are of imagination all compact, as it were, and the rest of us just plod along. Because if you actually ask yourself what a poem is, I mean, let's just take at random, say, you know, some lines of Shakespeare, just the famous opening of the 19th sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a day. Now, I say those words, quoting Shakespeare. Somehow, somewhere in your mind, you behold a summer's day. And then you begin to remember and summon up the images of summer's days that weren't quite as good as they could be. You see the rough winds shaking the darling buds of May. Your darling buds of May and my darling buds of May are slightly different because You happen to be walking in May in one place, and I was walking in May in another. But the beauty of that poem is mostly your work rather than Shakespeare's. What any Shakespeare or any poet does, he gives you the starter kit. Essentially, he's giving you a series of words, because the word summer is not summer, neither is the word day, day. The word summer is a two-syllabic sound. But by the time he returns to the word summer, and he's contrasting the beloved, saying, and that you can sum it up by saying, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? No, because you're way better. Here are the things that are wrong with summer for a few lines. And then he says, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. So by the time you come to summer again, you've not only imagined summer, you've also been brought by Shakespeare, but by your own imagination, to suddenly touch what summer has always meant. This beauty, this brilliance, which is somehow shadowed by its own passing. Summer's lease hath all too short a date. But by putting the word eternal and summer, it's a contradiction in terms, of course, because summer is a season, and by definition, a season is temporal. But by contrast with temporal, what eternal is. And when somebody says eternal summer, you experience what Owen Barfield, our great common enthusiasm, called a felt change of consciousness. That's what he said poetry is. It's a felt change of consciousness. It says that in Poetic Dictionary. But all okay, hooray, well done, Shakespeare. But Shakespeare gave you that. Taking home a Shakespeare sonnet is actually like taking home something from IKEA. You've got all the bits, but you actually put it together.
And I think that's why, although it's undoubtedly true that the imagination has us and in copious supply, it can also take us to places that is demanding in a way. There is this sort of felt shift of consciousness that guides us into an altered attention on the world. So I love Blake's line where he says, there is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed.
That's so
the Satan and the watch fiends, that's the narrow refusal. But every moment, if we do this almost kind of like standing back, even as we're standing into, we can realize, because we're humans and have this capacity for self-reflection as well as for experience, that this is the gateway. I think this is the end of the golden string, where we can become conscious of what's going on, and I think that's partly why this phrase, like you're saying, eternal summer, is so wonderful as well, because it makes us realize that behind the myriad things is the one source, or behind the many temporal, infinite number of manifestations is the eternal as well. And so kind of tuning into what's happening anyway is the way to, as you say, actively. I love that it's active, because that's very, very important for Blake as well. That he says actually that not being aware of the imagination is to be in a passive state, but being invited by it is to become active. And then it can renovate every moment of the day if rightly placed. So, this is not just like an optional extra that adds a bit colour for those who are that way inclined. In fact, I think it's fundamental not only to what's going on already in terms of our understanding and meaning, but is actually at the heart of any kind of spiritual life and expansion, so that, the divine countenance becomes more and more perceptible to us.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. I love that passage, and I think you make a great deal of good from it in your book. But it's really worth noticing Blake's language in that passage you've quoted. First of all, he uses the word industrious. He doesn't say the super imaginative or specially artistic people like me, with a sort of, a limp wrist and a lily. He actually says, no, he says, if you're industrious is a very workaday word. And then the word he uses for the way this moment once found can transform every moment in your day. The word he uses, renovate. Blokes with white vans and ladders turn up to do the renovations of things. Of course, renovare means to renew, to make new again, to renew. But I think there's something. I mean, Blake is an artisan. Blake is not a person who's born in the lap of luxury. He's not a person who's in any sense entitled in any of the English senses of that word. He learns a craft. He's an apprentice. He understands about inks and acids and copper plates and mixing pigments. He does the whole thing from the ground up. And I don't think he's any less brilliantly imaginative when he's doing the physical work of preparing the copper plate than he is when he's writing this astonishing poetry on it in this wonderful method of engraving that he himself invented. So I think we really need to bear that in mind in everything we said. There's a danger that every time we talk about words like spiritual or mystical, and believe me, we are right into the most profound spiritual mysticism, that people check out and think, well, that's not for me. That's, whereas Blake is very much, it's almost like a Zen thing. It's in the work. It's in the moment.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I love the way that he uses, because another word that he uses is progress, which has a whole kind of industrious, renovative kind of resonance for us as well. But he, without contraries is no progression. And so the workaday is absolutely there. And I think you feel this actually when you see his work. I remember seeing the quite well-known sketch which he did of Catherine, his wife, in pencil. And something about just the sweep of the line, the delicacy of it, which radiates with this love. And I remember seeing a copy of one of the Night Thoughts, these illustrations he did for a famous poem at the time. And again, the quality of the engraving, the fine. He talks a lot about the line, the importance of the line, and I think that's something about the immediacy that you're describing as well. His spirituality, to put it another way, it's not one that goes off into a sort of vague sense of the numinous or something. It's always absolutely tangible and right in front of you.
I'll tell you a Blake story from the point of view of Blake as a poet, as well as an engraver. And this is a comment I heard from another poet, the great poet Geoffrey Hill. So when I was an undergraduate in Pembroke at Cambridge in the late 70s, Geoffrey Hill, who was then I think at Leeds, came as a guest lecturer just for a week and lectured on Blake. And I sat in the front row thinking, boy, it was going to be good, and it was. So he quotes, I think it's a letter of Blake's to his brother when his brother was still alive, in which Blake is reflecting on what he's learning as an apprentice. And Blake says in the letter that the most important line in any work is the bounding line. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So Geoffrey Hill, of course, being a poet, alert to words, he sort of looks up from his notes and says, extraordinary choice of word from Blake there. The bounding line. Because he could have said the binding line, he could have said the boundary line, he could have said the outline. All of those are conveying something of what he means. But why bounding? And then he said, Blake chooses bounding because it's one of that small set of English words which are known as antonyms. That's to say, they're words which mean their own opposite as well as themselves simultaneously. So, a word like cleave. You have a cleaver to cleave things in two, but a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. Cleave means both at the same time. So bounding, on the one hand, can mean binding in, being bound, but bounding as a word also means excessive energy and exuberance, bounding about, grace abounding to the chief of sinners, bounding about. So Hill went on to say, why bounding? He said, because it's right, this central paradox, he said, at the heart of Blake's work, which is part, if you like, of his fearful symmetry, is that he sees the bounding line as concentrating the energy of the art, which might otherwise be dissipated. And then Hill immediately went on and said, look, if a modern free verse poet was writing a poem about a tiger, he'd have little crouching lines when the tiger was crouching, then he'd have long running on lines when the tiger was running about. And actually, the more he heaped adjectives on the tiger and the more excessive he became, the weaker the impression of the tiger would become. Whereas Blake chooses the tightest of forms and says, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?" And then Hill went on to say, I think Blake understands that the bounds of a work of art are like the walls of a furnace. They concentrate the fire inside. And of course, then he goes on to point out that the whole rest of the poem is about the tiger being made in the furnace, in what Dread had and what Dread Heart, So that was absolutely a revelation to me, not only about Blake, but actually about poetry and about all art. And it was the exact opposite of the vapid sort of, art talk of our days, where people are always pushing boundaries or pushing the envelope or being transgressive or transliminal or something. Nobody understands the power of the bounding line. Now, ultimately, Blake is going to bring you to the infinite and the eternal, but he does it in another favourite Blake phrase, which I think is a great watchword for any poet. He says, minute particulars. You have to do things in minute particulars. And that's where you get the, to infinity in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour, that it's not something vapid and ever expanding into some sort of vague, wishy-washy, undifferentiated spirituality. It's this grain of flour, this grain of sand, this wild flower,
Yeah, I mean, I love that. There's a wonderful story about the word bound, and it reminds me again in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he talks about the relationship between energy and reason. And I think that there's a similar kind of thing going on there. That energy and reason, at the end of the day, aren't opposites. They are. Reason is a kind of intensifier of the energy. He talks about it, I think, bounding the energy, and I think it's why he loves aphorisms actually as well. Of all the kind of literary forms he uses, of course, there's the free verse and other kinds of poetry, but the aphorism really he loved too, which is quite a traditional mode for philosophy, and I think because it has this intensifying effect.
An intense, brief sort of tetrameter rhyming couplets. If the
Yeah.
sun began to doubt, it would immediately go out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or the ruins of time build mansions in eternity. There you've got a whole treatise on the relationship between eternity and time, and even the ones that jolt. Like I don't know. Each outcry of the hunted hare, a fibre from the brain does tear.
Yeah.
There's something
that's very, very true. That's exactly this. It's like the other one: a horse misused upon the road cries out to heaven for human blood. He absolutely understands our kinship with the rest of nature. And he recognizes that every abuse of an innocent out there is a destruction of something in here.
Yeah. So that there's a rational relationship there that he's captured and intensified in the phrase, which I think is, part of his method as well. I mean, I try and say that, he definitely read all these figures like Locke and Adam Smith and others. But he could sort of get to the heart of the matter in a couple of lines, in a quatrain. And so I think he should be treated as a philosopher too.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk one of the phrases which I got from your book on Coleridge actually is that imagination is truth bearing, just to sort of nail it really. And I wonder, what does this mean for those who seek truth in theology as well? Can we kind of expand it in that direction? Because I think that you said that both Coleridge and Blake realised that if Christianity is to be renewed, it's going to be through a renewed understanding of the imagination. And then Blake makes this completely clear where he talks about Jesus, the imagination.
Oh, yeah.
How do you understand these kind of links?
Well, Blake says, I know of no Christianity other than the liberty to exercise the divine arts of imagination. So the first thing we have to say, if we're going to talk about the proper role of imagination and theology, which is very much being revived St Andrews has an institute for theology, imagination, and the arts. Duke University in America has a Duke Institute for theology and the arts, a Duke Initiative in theology and the arts. So this remarriage, as it were, of theology and the arts is important. So first thing you have to say is the thing I've already said, which is that do not misunderstand this as the capitulation of theology and some sort of lapsing admission. Okay, we were always just making stuff up. Fair enough. Let's be imaginative. We're not talking about that kind of imagination. We're talking about the recognition that the rational faculty that analyzes the world, and particularly that breaks it up into little parts, is missing something. It's certainly important, rational theology, but it's, as Wordsworth says, we murder to dissect. By the time you've got the thing splayed open, you've killed it. So there are things that are real, but which we can only come to know with other faculties. Shakespeare makes the distinction between apprehension and comprehension, and he says imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Now, we need both eyes. We need to see with both eyes. But we've only been squinting at the world, I think, in the last 300 years through the eye of reason. So the recovery of imagination in theology is about complementarity with reason. It's not an irrational reaction against reason. That's the first thing to say, just to get rid of any kind of bugbears or misunderstandings. Now, as soon as we start to address the question of the imagination and theology, we immediately come across the sort of fundamental paradox, which is that Christianity, like Judaism and Islam for that matter, believe in a God who is utterly transcendent. So beyond every framework, every category, every name, transcendent, not part of the created order in that sense. And yet it is a God who has chosen to create. So somewhere within that transcendence is a creative capacity. And when we have this particular line in the end of the first chapter of Genesis, that human beings are singled out in that creation account as having been made in the image of God. And of course, the word image is inside the word imagination, in the image and likeness of God. There's a branch of theology which is trying to take seriously that our creative faculties, including our capacity, both to perceive the world imaginatively and to make those imaginative constructs, which then become truth-bearing, which, everybody knows perfectly well, when they watch the play Macbeth, that they're watching a fiction. But every time they watch it, they found out real truths about themselves. They understand more about the human soul. And to take a more extreme example, Middle Earth is an imagined world. It's what Tolkien calls a subcreation. But all kinds of real but invisible things like loyalty and friendship and hope in the teeth of despair, all those things are given us. So what follows from that for theology is two things. First of all, that we can begin to look at our own creative capacities as a kind of theology through anthropology. Can we find out a little bit more about how we make things and think about how God makes things, how God makes us? Think about the way any artist is invested in and loves their work. They're distinct from their work, and yet they're in every part of their work. That's actually a very helpful analogy for the transcendence immanence axis in theology, which in purely rational systematic theology, a great deal of ink has been spilled. But actually, as soon as we have the analogy of a work of imagination, we find the same thing. And obviously, particularly in the beginning of John's Gospel, you get this real coup de théâtre, this lightning bolt. You couldn't start with more abstract language than in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. You're kind of up there in the ether. You can't imagine it. Literally, you cannot imagine that. And then suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, comes the 14th verse of the prologue. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. and we beheld his glory. We actually saw it, glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the abstract meets the particular. And how does it do it? It does it through a work of divine incarnation. And one of the ways in which, if I've made a contribution to this area of thought, it's probably been at least partly just in the observation that a very famous passage of Shakespeare about the nature of the poetic imagination, I think I've shown, I think it may be the only person, is actually a riff on the prologue to John's Gospel. So the famous passage everybody will know is the description of the poet. The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And again, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So I was reading this. I'd often written about the nature of poetry from this. But when I came to write, I mean, some years ago now, it came out in 2010, I think, so it's 15 years ago, my book, Faith, Hope and Poetry, Theology and the Poetic Imagination, I returned to this passage just to remind myself what poetry is. But of course, I was now thinking within a theological frame. And I suddenly thought, this is all very, where do we get this heaven, earth, heaven, all things, creation, a word, and then the absolute paradox, imagination on the one hand, juxtaposed with the word bodies on the other. And I realized that Shakespeare is using the language of unexpected incarnation to account for the nature of poetry. And of course, the play is set in Athens BC. So, he's playing with us in all kinds of ways, and it's a very playful play. But I think there is at the very least an analogy between our desire to body forth and incarnate and the Christian contention that the whole of the unimaginable love and heavenliness of God is by God's, if you like, poetic work of imagination bodied forth into the person of Jesus. I would go a little further. I'd say possibly, if you take that, obviously you'd be a Christian who took that, but as a Christian, since I take that to be primal and paradigmatic truth, it leads me to the startling conclusion that all human creativity, everywhere, in whatever faith or by whomsoever, whether it's a Hindu artist or an atheist artist or anybody, that when they're doing that magical bodying and that they're making a finite thing which is capable of almost infinite interpretation, which is bodying forth the form of things unknown. That's the point. That's why poetry is a way of knowing, or imagination is truth-telling, because it gives form to things you wouldn't otherwise know. They exist, but they're unknown until they're bodied forth and given form. And I would say that any artist anywhere who's doing that, I would say is doing something which is founded in and partakes of this extraordinary moment of incarnation. Now, that doesn't mean I rush in and say, oh, look, you're a secret. I mean, the long, proper, courteous, carefully developed conversation between sincere persons of different faiths has to happen gradually and courteously. But I can still believe, one of the things I can believe as a Christian is that the God with whom I have to do is the mind that holds everything together and is graciously at work in the imaginations of everybody I meet.
I think that's so important for many, many ways. I'm not least of which because it's true and it's wonderful, but also because I think it helps correct so much that even within the church you come across, and I think it's become particularly in Western Europe, become a kind of public perception of Christianity, which is that in a way it's sort of the opposite of that. It's not about bodying forth. It's actually about pinning down. And when Christianity becomes a moral creed, for example, which Blake, I think, spotted, the wastes of moral law, as he puts it, he realised that it was killing all this. And I think that I love this idea of the kingdom of God that's within you, to use another biblical expression. That too is, I think, another kind of, the way to understand that is through this bodying forth. And understanding that so much of Jesus' teaching, the parables and the sayings of the kingdom and so on, are precisely doing the same, I think, that they're nudging us towards this kind of abundance that's continually flowing. And Christianity needs to recover that. I think you find it actually in a lot of other traditions, not least
I think the
Indian traditions.
About the teaching of Jesus is that, to use two necessarily related words, his teaching is both generous and generative. That it's continuously suggesting new things to us, particularly the parables where he doesn't give a neat cut and dried, or the disciples haven't added a neat cut and dried thing. But some of those sayings, I mean, the kingdom is like leaven. That's something that breathes and works and expands and multiplies and raises. The kingdom is like leaven in the dough. It's not like a butterfly pinned on a board.
Yeah. There's another, just slightly going down the Barfield rabbit hole, and I'll try and explain it a bit. But I've been very excited recently because Rory O'Connor, who has been editing a lot of Barfield's unpublished articles, particularly, and a year or two got them together in a book, The Riddle of the Sphinx. He sent me something which he's working on now, which is an article that Barfield wrote about Blake. And Barfield mentions Blake quite a few times, but always sort of in passing. But this is it's only 1,500 words or so, but a bit more of an extended article. But anyway, the point is that in it, Barfield argues that Blake is one of the people that brings in what Barfield called final participation. And so these are all rather Barfieldian technical terms, but let me illustrate it with one word, which is a big Blakean word. And Barfield spots something, and I wanted to put this to you because I'll see whether it resonates. He spotted that when Blake uses the word energy, he's using it very much in the way that, say, Paul would use the word energeia, which isn't often translated as energy. It's normally translated as work or something like that. But the point is that this energy, again, has this kind of inner intention, which I think, you're pointing to in the discussion of bodied forth, that it's not just some random free-formed kind of stuff that might do something for you, but is always already nudging you towards the good, the beautiful, and the true, wanting to return you to this sort of fullness of awareness and fullness of reality. So energy, reading energy in Blake, energy is the only life, and so on, he will say. He's not making a sort of fairly anodyne comment about vitality. He's saying, no, that this is part of the divine presence amongst us. So when we feel that too, we're sensing the divine presence and the return of awareness to the divine presence.
I mean, I think I'd be very interested to see whether he links Blake's use of the word energy with any discussion of the Holy Spirit. Because the Holy Spirit, the images of the Holy Spirit in Scripture, are all images of force in motion, whether it's the flames or whether it's the river or the fountain, or whether it's the wind that moves, the pneuma, which is both spirit and breath, and wind that is upon the face of the deep. That is some aspect, if you like, of the divine energy. So I think, I think that's really interesting. I mean, it'll be very interesting to go back to my sort of favorite Blake passages and look again with this alertness to the word energy. I think Blake is very, very particular and exact about his language. I don't think a single word falls idly in Blake's writing. It's got exactly that precision. I think what Blake offers us is the concentration of energy, the pointedness of energy to a particular place at a particular moment. He's the opposite of diffuse. He's concentrated. I think we need him for that reason. I mean, famously, of course, the infinity in a grain of sand. Because I think most of the forces at work in contemporary society are vociferous and what's they're about abstracting you out of things rather than allowing you to be present in them. I remember when I first had an iPhone, I wrote a little verse to it, thinking which went, I am familiar with 100 faces, all famished for their 15 minutes fame. I am half present in 100 places, but never present in the place I am. And we have a natural tendency to abstraction anyway. And we need to resist those. They're centripetal rather than centrifugal, I think, or whichever the way around those two words are. They're whirling us out. And the kind of apotheosis of that is this absurd desire of people to somehow upload their very consciousness to the cloud, as they call it. Whereas the thrust of Blake's work is in a Christian sense incarnational. When Albion confronts the image of the crucified so he was crucified on a magnificent tree, not on a cross, in Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. This is the point where Albion repents and says, I have turned aside from into the wastes of the moral law. But he says, addressing Christ, he says, it's a classic piece of Blake here. O divine body, O human imagination, which I have crucified. Not human body, divine imagination, which is what you would have expected. Whom I have crucified, I have turned aside from thee. So there's something about the divine imagination bodied forth in Jesus, such that the body is divine, and if his body is divine, then ultimately so is ours, which is there in the poem at the end of the Songs of Experience on the divine image. But also that the human imagination is somehow there in Christ in its fullest, and that one of the things we do when we crucify Christ is to crucify that imagination. And what Blake is ultimately calling us to is an awakening, is the resurrection of that crucified imagination. And for him, I think, that's not only a cosmic event, it is in some sense a Christocentric event.
So just say a little bit more what you mean there. This is the Christo.
So what I'm saying is I'm taking the first thing which just needs to be said into the sort of morass of Blake's scholarship, that though Blake was understandably and quite properly hostile to the church of his day, Jesus, considered as both human and divine, is central to Blake's writing and thinking. But the Jesus with whom he has to do is not the Jesus who, as it were, is boxed into the creedal formulations of the church, but is a Jesus who represents and embodies the divine imagination and also the human imagination meeting together. And that I think he thinks that, Albion says, the whole of that poem, that visionary poem, Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, deals with the problem that Albion, who symbolically is all of humanity, but also particularly English humanity, is asleep and, as it were, not fully awake, not fully alert to who he is. And in this sleep, he's actually he's dreaming the nightmare of imperialism and slavery and the Industrial Revolution and conquest. And he needs to awaken from all of that. And eventually he does awaken. But the turning point is this recognition when he looks at Jesus crucified, that he has crucified the imagination. But that terrible as it is, that moment, of course it contains a hidden hope, because the crucifixion is followed by the resurrection. And what I think we get at the end of that poem is a glimpse of the resurrection. And I think Blake feels that when the doors of perception are cleansed, when we see everything in glory, then part of that will be a recognition of the glory of Christ in us and in everyone.
Yeah, Kathleen Rain, actually, she, in one of her talks on Blake, she made the observation that Blake realised that things have become external, and even in the Christian church particularly, everything's become sort of externalised. So there's the effort to try and prove that the resurrection happened. There's the effort to try and work out, what is the literal meaning of the scriptures and so on. And that externalising, she feels, is a bit like the crucifying you're talking about. And that, but what happens quite spontaneously though is that there's a turn to the inward, and an attempt to try and find the vitality that is otherwise being lost, which he felt
Yeah.
actually was one of the big reasons why people don't think to look to the church. They go off in myriad other directions, and of course the loss of that is an overarching integrative capacity. So you get a
Yeah.
kind of supernova of effects, to use Charles Taylor's
I mean, she's right.
phrase.
The only caveat we want to add to that is that these very terms, inner and outer, are part of what has been bequeathed to us by the Enlightenment. That actually, I mean, Coleridge wonderfully says in his essay on poetry, considered as one of the fine arts, he says, to make the outer inner and the inner outer, this is the essence of genius in the fine arts. That's what we're trying to do. We recognize that everything out there is an expression of the consciousness that is also in here. I mean, obviously, Barfield takes this very seriously in all kinds of ways in his notion of the evolution of consciousness. But all I'm saying is, I don't want to set up a complete quarrel between the inner and outer, and say outer bad, inner good, and go in for some privatized inner mysticism, because those categories are being used falsely if we use them as the Enlightenment used them.
No, I completely agree. I mean, back to your point about.
So I don't want to quarrel between these two things. I think. I mean, for me as a Christian, the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus is equally objectively and subjectively true. It's a turning point of the cosmos, but the cosmos is the cosmos that we know, insofar as we know it as human beings. The human imagination is part of it. So we need, and we're not knowing it in anything like as rich and full and stereoscopic way as we could know it, because we're at the moment with rational science, we're only looking at it through one eye.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Blake's way of putting it perhaps as well is he talks about centers and circumferences, and the circumference becoming the center and the center being the circumference. And of course, also, as you said right at the beginning, there's the difference between difference and distinction. And the contraries that I feel that they hold a kind of field or a tension. And it's in that field or tension that there's the energy for, again, the bodying force for
and the energy is often generated precisely by paradox. It's like when you bring the opposites together. It's rather like the if you ever did those experiments with bar magnets in science when you were a kid, where you see this in simple looking bar and you stick it under, but we have iron filings scattered on a paper, and when you bring the bar magnet up underneath the paper, the iron filings suddenly make this beautiful pattern which delineates a field of energy. Then you would take the same two bar magnets and you'd have them one way, they would just click. But if you turned one of them round and tried to push them together, you would feel, it was invisible, but you would feel this pulsing energy between the two of them. And I think a certain creative and imaginative energy is generated precisely when we bring things we were told were contraries, like outer and inner, or infinite and particular, or objective and subject. When we start bringing them together and recognizing that they're aspects of the same thing, then a great and good kind of energy is released, just as we feel it pulsing between the magnets.
And, isn't that good advice for today, when, of course, the inclination is precisely to try and separate and say, you're for this and against that, or on one side or the other, and so on, rather than trying to hear and listen to the connections. Yeah,
it's interesting that we actually use the language drawn from magnetism to describe this very thing. We talk about a polarized society, and we think of the two poles of the magnet or the two poles of the earth. But the earth wouldn't be the earth and the magnet wouldn't be the magnet unless there were actual lines of power running reciprocally back and forth between the two poles. This is why Coleridge, just to put in a word for the great man again, developed what he called polar logic, which was about not having antinomies. It was about recognizing, as I think Swedenborg said, that contraria sunt complementa, contraries are complementary.
Look, Malcolm, we've covered a lot of ground, rich material. I hope it's been inspiring and people have felt the energy as well as hearing about it. I want, there's other things we go on to. When you're talking about contraries, Darren, thinking also about the role of the self in all this, and annihilate the
The
selfhood in.
self and other is another of those contraries and complementary.
Yeah, but so it's like giving. Well, giving you receive, of course, is the familiar formula, but there's something about that focus again, that when you have the focus from within yourself and then you offer it in in a reflection of the generosity of the divine, of course. So yeah, that often feels very present to me. And like when he talks about kissing the joy as it flies and living in a
that's so good, yeah, I mean that's one of the great paradoxes. Absolutely true. He who binds to himself for joy doth the winged life destroy. But he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. Eternity's sunrise, of course, is another of those paradoxes, because we think of sunrise as a marker of time. But he says, no, there is an eternal sunrise. Like Shakespeare says, there's an eternal summer.
Let's draw to a close there.
Yeah,
hopefully, I can feel the end of the golden string. I want to wind it more into a ball. So I hope that that is a good invitation for those who've been listening in as well. It's very good to see you talk about these things, hear the poetry flowing from your lips as it always does. Just say, where can people find out more about what you're doing? What are you up to at the moment and so on?
Well, so my big thing at the moment, I mean, I've published 5 collections of lyric poetry, but foolishly, probably foolhardily, I've decided to have a go at epic. I'm going to write a big sweeping narrative poem, which is very much about exactly lifting the veil, cleansing the doors of perception. And the story, the material I've taken is what's called the Matter of Britain, the whole cycle of legends about King Arthur, and especially for me, the stories about the Holy Grail. And that's going to, it's a big work. It's going to be in 4 volumes. But the first volume, which is simply called Galahad and the Grail, is coming out in March. And actually, it's interesting. When I say epic, I don't want that to be off-putting people. I've actually written it in a kind of ringing, swinging ballad style. In fact, that was the breakthrough for me. I didn't know how to do it. And then my long study of Coleridge and my realization of how much there was in the rhyme of the ancient Mona, and how brilliantly he'd taken the traditional, if you like, ballad form in its kind of rustic nature, and then made it into this incredibly sensitive poetic form and instrument. I thought, well, I'll take a leaf out of Coleridge's book. So I'm writing really the stories of King Arthur in ballad form in a way that I hope will be accessible to younger people as well as older readers. I hope the people that like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings will also like this.
Well, I can say I was lucky enough to have a bit of a foretaste of that around a fire with you reading it out 2 or 3 months back, and it is going to be tremendous, I think. So yeah. I do look forward to that. And
I did enjoy doing that. Yeah, so that's the new project.
Very good.
Okay, well, really good to see you again, Mark. I hope we'll meet in person rather than just on the flat screen sometime soon.
That'd be very lovely to do indeed. Cheers for now, Malcolm. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Bye.